Europe had seemingly had its fill of Master Higgins after 2 games, but the chubby funster returned for a 3rd outing in North America. The new damsel in distress goes by the name of Genie Jungle, and this time it's aliens who have been doing the capturing. Seemingly, the evil witch doctor had had his fill too. Master Higgins can duck for the first time in this game, and there's now a 5th dinosaur character, a Tripetosaurus, which has a rolling attack. If you aren't familiar with the Tripetosaurus species, that's because it doesn't exist. It's basically just a fancy Triceratops. There was also a surfing bonus game this time around. Fun fact, Master Higgins would return in a 4th Adventure Island in Japan for the Famicom in 1994. Adventure Island 4 ended up being the last game released for the Famicom. Cheers! Disney's theme parks have always been a place of wonder, so a video game in which you explore one of them makes perfect sense. Adventures in Magic Kingdom features 5 different stages, each themed around a famous Disney ride. There are 2 platforming sections based on the Pirates of the Caribbean and Haunted Mansion, 2 vehicle sections based on Big Thunder Mountain and Autopia, and a strange Space Mountain level where you have to quickly respond to button prompts, similar to a QuickTime event in modern games. The aim is to clear all of these stages and answer trivia questions dotted around the park, to collect silver keys that will open Cinderella's castle and let the Disney parade begin. Fun fact, Adventures in the Magic Kingdom's music was composed by Yoko Shimomura, who went on to score the Kingdom Hearts games. Cheers! It may be more or less forgotten these days, but in the late 1980s, Crocodile Dundee was one of the biggest movies in America. The Adventures of Bayou Billy clearly took some inspiration from it, but instead of Australia, the game's set in New Orleans. The player controls Billy West, a former soldier who has to rescue his girlfriend Annabelle from New Orleans crime boss Godfather Gordon. This involves 9 stages, comprised of 3 completely different playstyles. While most of the game is side-scrolling beat-em-up in the style of Double Dragon, other stages involve driving sections, and most memorably, light gun stages which the player can use the NES zapper to take out enemies. Fun fact, Bayou Billy may not have been a smash hit, but Nintendo pushed it to the point that Billy featured in an episode of its cartoon series, Captain Ed. Cheers! Dino Riki is a courageous and intelligent young man determined to establish mankind's future in this violent age. The age in question is the prehistoric era, which means that we have a vertical scrolling shoot-'em-up in which instead of flying a ship through space, you're a caveman wandering through the land. Typical weapons like lasers and missiles are dished in favor of rocks, axes, boomerangs, and flaming torches. One of the game's oddest power-ups transforms Dino Riki into Macho Riki, a powerful alter ego who can fire clones of himself at enemies. It only lasts for a while, though when it runs out you lose all of your weapon upgrades. Oddly, this made it a power-up players actively tried to avoid. Fun fact, Dino Riki's appearance was based on a Korean-Japanese wrestler, Riki Chosu, who appeared in TV ads for the game. Cheers! For some reason, Bandai America decided that the perfect game for children in the early 90s was one based on a TV sitcom from the 1960s. Split into 4 episodes or levels, the game has Gilligan and the Skipper exploring the tropical island from the show in an attempt to find a way off of it. Along the way, they encounter their fellow Gilligan's Island castaways, take part in boss battles with a gorilla, a bear, a skeleton, and a cannibal. In an interesting move, there's a dialogue box at the bottom of the screen where Gilligan and the Skipper continuously have conversations as you play. Sadly, these can get pretty repetitive, meaning they become more of an annoyance than anything else. Fun fact, the only character missing from the game is Ginger, played by Tina Louise. This may have been because she refused to have anything to do with the show after it ended. After a couple of Japan-only releases, Eggerland finally made its way overseas in the form of Adventures of Lolo, an NES game which was just really a compilation of stages taken from its predecessor and presented to a Western audience for the first time. The joy in Adventures of Lolo lies in its simplicity. Lolo can only really move in 4 directions, push blocks, and occasionally gain the ability to fire a total of 2 shots at enemies per stage. This limited moveset means you're able to quickly master everything Lolo can do, meaning all of your attention can be focused on the game's 50 challenging stages full of traps, enemies, and treasure chests. Between Japan and the West, a total of 12 Eggerland games were released. Fun fact, Lolo and his female counterpart, Lala, made a handful of appearances in Kirby games. Interesting though, they were enemies. If the phrase, "if it ain't broke, don't fix it," has really been more closely adhered to than in the second Adventures of Lolo game. Sit a screenshot of the first and second game next to each other, and you'd be hard-pressed to tell them apart. Other than some new animations like enemies disappearing in a puff of smoke when you beat a level, the two look identical. Still, fans of the game were happy with what was essentially just 50 more levels of what they'd enjoyed in the first Lolo, and all is well in the world. Lolo 2 isn't a complete clone, mind you. One of the new additions is the Pro levels. 4 new stages unlocked with passwords, which are obscenely difficult to solve. Fun fact, the Japanese version of Adventures of Lolo 2 is considered a separate game, mainly due to the fact that many of the levels were different than its American counterpart. Thanks for your support, guys. Cheers. Unlike the second Lolo game, the third does actually mix things up a little. Rather than having Lolo rescue Lala yet again, this time the pair are teaming up to stop the evil King Edgar, who's turned everyone into stone. This means you can now play any stage as Lolo or Lala, though their abilities are identical. A new world map has been added, which adds a small degree of choice to which stages you take on next, and new gameplay elements like boss fights, crumbling bridges, and a new whale enemy called Moby allow for new puzzle mechanics. It's notably trickier than its predecessors, but this time you have infinite lives. Fun fact, the only other Lolo game released in the West was Adventures of Lolo on the Game Boy, where you have to solve puzzles to get theme park rides working again. Cheers. Rat Gravity is a space hero with an unusually large chin. He's been tasked with traveling to 8 different planets and locating the missing compumines, which connect to each other and share knowledge, to foil the evil wizard Agathos, who shut them down. The result is an action platformer in which each planet has a unique look. The most infamous of these is Turvia, a planet where gravity is reversed and everything on the screen is therefore upside down. Rat Gravity never went down as a truly iconic NES release by any means, but any game with a trash planet called Effluvia can never be considered a waste of time. Fun fact, the game's manual includes a 14-page comic illustrated by Frank Scirocco, who is best known for co-creating Marvel's Alien Legion series. Cheers. In terms of plots, this one's a doozy. Rocky and Bullwinkle, stars of the 60s cartoon series of the same name, have to make their way to England so that Bullwinkle can inherit his late grandfather's title of Earl of Moosechester. The problem is, they have to get there before their rivals, Boris and Natasha, who plan to impersonate Bullwinkle and get the riches first. Licensed platform games vary widely in difficulty, but this one's one of the worst. The music is off-key and repetitive, the level design is confusing, Rocky can't climb stairs, and Bullwinkle's attack drains his energy, meaning killing enemies hurts you too. Fun fact, June Foray, the voice of Rocky in the cartoon show, was also the voice of Looney Tunes character Granny for more than 50 years. Cheers! Mark Twain's famous 1876 novel may seem like an odd source for a video game, and it would appear Seta and Wikisoft agreed, since the NES rendition has very little to do with the book. The entire game takes place in one of Tom's dreams. He's fallen asleep at school, and the player has to rescue Becky Thatcher from his nemesis Injun Joe by making his way through 6 enemy-infested stages. Oddly, the North American version of the game has its levels shuffled, meaning it starts with a difficult pirate ship stage, the 5th in the Japanese version. This makes for a game which starts off much harder than it does in Japan. Fun fact, it seems Seta didn't fancy the player's chances of beating this game much. The manual has a page dedicated to revealing in detail what happens at the end. Cheers! A fleet of exploratory spaceships from the planet Farmel have discovered 8 massive space fortresses, heading towards the planet to destroy it. It's up to ace pilot Hal Bailman to fly solo into each fortress and destroy it from the inside. This process actually consists of 2 game styles. Each stage begins with a side-scrolling shoot-'em-up, in which Hal, named after the developer, flies his ship towards one of the fortresses. Once he gets inside, the action switches to a side-scrolling action platformer where the player has to find and destroy the central reactor, then escape before the fortress explodes. An impressive game that further cemented HAL's status as a top NES developer. Fun fact, the password for the last level is Suga. This is a reference to Hiroki Suga, the game's director, designer, and programmer. Cheers. Airwolf was an 80s TV series about a military helicopter armed to the teeth with a crazy amount of high-tech gadgetry. The NES rendition has the show's main hero, Stringfellow Hawk, flying to a series of POW camps and attempting to rescue all the MIA prisoners being held captive there. Like many other flight sims of the time, the game's mainly played with a first-person viewpoint as you attempt to shoot down enemy fighters. When you reach a camp, the on-screen switches to a side-on view as you try to slowly land and collect the prisoners. A Japanese Airwolf game was also released. It was a side-scrolling shooter and was completely different. Not so fun fact, the real Airwolf chopper that was featured in the show became an air ambulance in Germany. Tragically, it crashed in a thunderstorm in 1992, killing its crew. Cheers. Despite the presence of two-time Indy 500 winner Al Unser Jr., Turbo Racing is actually a game based on Formula One racing. That's because it's an English-language version of a Famicom title, World Grand Prix, pole to finish, with Mr. Unser Jr. only really there to pop up from time to time and give you advice on your upcoming race. The game itself is a relatively accomplished racing game, which receives some criticism for the way its turns appear with little warning. Given that Al Unser Jr. isn't so famous in Europe, the PAL version of the game was simply called Turbo Racing, and all references to him were removed. Fun fact, although the game's tracks were loosely based on real-life F1 Grand Prix circuits, which all have distinct lengths, here they are all roughly 3.3 miles long, or 5.3k. Cheers! Although Capcom released an Aladdin game for the Super Nintendo, the official NES version, released only in Europe, was instead based on the Mega Drive game originally developed by Version Games. While the 16-bit version was widely praised for its outstanding character animation and music, the NES port struggled to reach the same level of quality. Movement is sluggish, large sections of the screen disappear without warning, and attacking your enemies can literally be a hit-and-miss affair, as apples thrown at foes often don't register. This culminates in a final boss battle with Evil Jafar, who just stands there while you lob fruit at him from a distance until he dies. Fun fact, another version of Aladdin was released on the NES. This was a surprisingly good but completely unofficial port of the Super Nintendo game. Cheers! Our unlikely hero, Alfred Chicken, has to rescue Billy and Floella from evil mecha chickens. Who are Billy and Floella? The game doesn't tell us, I'm afraid. Regardless, there are 5 large stages, which Alfred has to navigate, armed with his trusty dive bomb move, which lets him plummet to the ground and attack enemies with his beak. Alfred Chicken is notorious for its divisive main theme. Some believe its circus-style riff is fun, others are adamant it's one of the worst soundtracks in gaming. A toll-free number, 1-800-ALFRED-C, was also set up in the US so players could hear a message from Alfred himself promoting the game. Fun fact, as a UK publicity stunt, the game's product manager stood for election in Dorset, representing the Alfred Chicken Party. He finished 13th out of 14 candidates, with a 0.02% of the vote. The third Alien movie introduced its heroine, Ellen Ripley, on a prison where all weapons are banned. In the NES version of Alien 3, Ripley is armed to the teeth with pulse rifles, machine guns, flamethrowers, and grenades. While the Super Nintendo version of Alien 3 was akin to Super Metroid, NES owners instead got a port of the more common version available on Mega Drive, Amiga, Commodore 64, Master System, and Game Gear. Here Ripley has to make her way through a series of corridor-laden stages, find all the trapped prisoners in each. If she fails to do this before the timer runs out, chest bursters explode out of the prisoners, which is far from ideal. Fun fact, the Alien 3 movie was infamous for going through production hell. Director David Fincher felt they had no control over it, and $7 million was spent on sets that were never used. Cheers! Japanese studio ICOM's attempt at a basketball game featured 8 unofficially licensed teams. For example, New York Knicks was now New York Slicks, and the option for 2 players to take on a CPU opponent together. It featured a vertical view of the court, something that was fairly unique at the time when most basketball games offered a side-on view. This had its limitations, however, presumably to avoid the bottom basket getting in the way. Every time the ball crossed the halfway line, the action would freeze and the court would flip around, so the attacking team was always shooting upwards. Despite this, it was critically acclaimed with impressive cutscenes during the dunks. Fun fact, Japanese publisher Vic Tokai now deals in telecoms and is known for Tokai Communications. The Vic stood for Valuable Information and Communication. Cheers! Known as Armored Scrum Object in Japan, Alpha Mission is an NES port of an SNK arcade shoot-'em-up. It's interesting in that the player has two different types of shot, lasers for enemies flying towards you and missiles for enemies based on the ground. It was also notoriously harsh with its power-ups. Since of the 11 different types, 4 of them are bad. Their effects range from sending you backwards and making you do certain areas again, to outright removing all of your energy and power. This can make it an extremely difficult game for anyone who doesn't read the manual and just assumes, as in most shooters, that you're supposed to collect everything. Fun fact, Alpha Mission got a sequel, the cleverly titled Alpha Mission 2, which was released on SNK's Neo Geo hardware. It's currently available to download on the Nintendo Switch. Cheers! Amagon is apparently the most decorated Marine who has been sent to a mysterious South Pacific island to investigate reports of monsters living there. After crash landing on the island, Amagon realizes his rescue ship is on the other side, so he has to fight his way through the monsters to reach it and leave the island in one piece. Thankfully, as a Marine, he obviously has the ability to transform into Megagon, a sort of super strong version of his normal self. While Amagon didn't exactly set the gaming world alight, it did have one interesting idea. The strength of his Megagon form depended on how many points the player collected as Amagon. For every 5,000 points scored, Megagon could take an extra hit before dying. Fun fact, it's a shame that Amagon wasn't released in the West under its Japanese title, which translates to, suddenly, Macho Man. Cheers! American Gladiators, much like the UK version that launched a few years later, was a TV game show where members of the public competed in a series of athletic events against the Gladiators, a group of overpowered meatheads. This made it ripe for a video game tie-in, but rather than take the show's events and recreate them like for like, the NES version offered an over-the-top video game-style version. The one-on-one joust event became a side-scrolling affair, while the wall, in which contestants simply tried to climb a big wall, became a huge maze with numerous obstacles. The result was a game that ended up being far more entertaining than the more realistic offerings on the Mega Drive and SNES in the following years. Fun fact, in 1995, the International Gladiators series ran, bringing together gladiators from the US, UK, Finnish, and Russian versions of the show. Cheers! Proudly declaring itself Nintendo's first video board game, Anticipation is Rare's take on what would happen if Pictionary and Trivial Pursuit had a digital baby. The board is based on the latter. Players travel around and land on colored categories, with the aim being to answer one of the questions of each color. The questions, however, take the form of Pictionary-style puzzles, in which the game slowly draws a picture and players have to buzz in with their controller to guess what it is. Higher difficulty settings remove some of the guides, like the clues, number of letters, and so on. It offers support for up to 4 players, but since it was released before the Force Score adapter, 2 players each share a controller. Fun fact, Anticipation also borrows from Monopoly with its object-shaped tokens. Players can choose from a pair of shoes, a teddy bear, a horn, or an ice cream cone. Before there was NBA Jam, there was Arch Rivals. Dubbed a basket brawl by developer Midway, it's very much the prototype that eventually became the more popular NBA Jam series. The game features 2-on-2 basketball with very few rules. Rather than the non-contact sport it's supposed to be, players are instead completely free to punch their opponents to the ground with no penalties given as a result. The NES version of the game looks significantly poorer than the arcade version, and while it didn't have the game-breaking bug the Mega Drive version suffered, from where you could score 95% of the shots thrown regardless of where you were on the court, other glitches like 3-point dunks still meant it was far from perfect. Fun fact, the arcade version of Arch Rivals featured a move where you could grab a jumping player's shorts and pull them down, revealing their underwear. Cheers! Archon is an interesting take on chess, where the player actually gets a chance to control the outcome when the two pieces clash. Rather than kings, queens, and bishops, Archon deals instead with banshees, golems, and wizards. As in chess, each piece has their own rules for movement. The main difference, however, is that when you attempt to capture an opposing piece, the action instead switches to an arena where the two characters involved have a fight, which is fully controlled by the players. In this way, you can potentially avoid your opponent's capture and take their piece out of action instead. This does, however, mean it's less about strategy and more about player skill during the battle scenes. Fun fact, Archon was designed by Paul Rishi III, who went on to co-found Toys for Bob. The studio developed the Skylanders games, Crash reboots, and is now working on Call of Duty. Cheers! While it was Atari's breakout that invented the brick-breaking genre, it was Arkanoid that built on its foundations to set the template for other imitators to follow. This was thanks to three major innovations: varied stages with different block layouts, enemies that got in the way, and most critically, the addition of power-ups that dropped down and gave you different abilities. While the arcade version of Arkanoid was played with a knob that was turned to control the paddle speed, this isn't possible with an NES controller's D-pad, even though the game does support it. As a result, the game was bundled with a VOS controller, an analog knob that gave you a similar level of control to the arcade game. Fun fact, the game's final level pits you against DOH, a floating head which acts as the game's final boss. If you get game over here, you can't continue. Cheers! The evil Shogun has stolen the magical ring that protects the city of Akrista, as well as the Elven Kingdom's treasured wealth amulet and elf mirror. A young elf named Christine decides to go and retrieve them, even though her fellow villagers tell her not to. Akrista's ring bears many similarities to The Legend of Zelda, and not just because the people get confused and think its title was referring to the protagonist. It's a top-down adventure game with similar dungeons to Link's first adventure, and while it doesn't come close to matching Nintendo's game in terms of quality, it does still have some interesting things going for it, like the ability to upgrade your bow and obtain magic wands that shoot fire. Fun fact, the game's manual features a groan-worthy joke in which it states the Cyclops enemy doesn't have a high enough IQ. Cheers! Asterix the Gaul is upset. His super strong pal, Obelix, has been kidnapped by the Romans. They carried him off while he was sleeping, and without this most powerful fighter, the village is wide open for a Roman invasion. The village council sends Asterix off in search of Obelix, in a journey that takes in Gaul, Switzerland, Spain, Egypt, and finally Rome, where Caesar plans to throw Obelix to the lions. Asterix was never released in North America, presumably because the character was far more popular in Europe. However, with its colorful and detailed graphics, it's one of the better PAL region exclusives. Fun fact, the Asterix series of comics and cartoons is so popular in Europe that when its native France launched its first satellite in 1965, they named it Asterix. Cheers! Astyanax is your typical boy dreams about girl is trapped in bubble, boy is transported to another dimension by a fairy and asked to save the girl, who turns out to be a princess. Although Jalico launched the NES version alongside an arcade game with the same name, the two are completely separate adventures with entirely different plots. Here, Astyanax is armed with an axe, but can upgrade it to a spear and then a sword. He also has a selection of magic spells, letting him perform freezing, fire, and thunder attacks on enemies. Occasionally, he'll encounter Cutie, the aforementioned fairy, who will restore his magic or change his weapon. Fun fact, the arcade version is instead about a man called Roche who's given a mythical fire axe by God and asked to save the world by killing a demon. Cheers! Athena is the goddess of wisdom, but despite this, she's bored sitting in her castle. So she travels to the fantasy world to fight some monsters, just to liven things up a bit. That's literally the plot of this port of SNK's action platformer, which hit arcades the previous year. Initially weaponless, Athena can collect 11 different weapons along the way, ranging from an iron ball and chain to a fire sword. Although the arcade version of Athena had its fans, the NES conversion was notorious for its extremely temperamental collision detection. Sometimes you'll kill enemies when you're nowhere near them, and sometimes your weapon can pass right through them without incident. Fun fact, the Japanese Famicom release of Athena came with a bright pink cassette tape featuring music from the game's arcade sequel, Psycho Soldier. Cheers! The first of 10 games in Bandai's Family Trainer series, Athletic World was bundled with what was originally known as the Family Fun Fitness. This was a large floor mat that plugged into the NES controller port and let the player control the game with their feet, like an early version of an arcade dance game. Athletic World features 5 different events: hurdles, hop-a-log, animal trail, rafting, and dark tunnel, and each player got a tailored device based on their age and gender. Nintendo of America quickly set up a deal with Bandai to license the Family Fun Fitness, which was promptly pulled off the shelves, rebranded, and released as the Nintendo Power Pad. Fun fact, there are 2 types of Athletic World packaging, one with the Family Fun Fitness logo and one saying it's compatible with the Power Pad. The Family Fun Fitness one is much rarer. Cheers!